many, not only the future, but also the economic future of the country. And very glad to have a chance to be able to join in this conversation with some of the country's best experts on the question. Just to let you know, we're recording this for both a podcast and on Zoom as well. So you'll be able to listen in on all what we're talking about later on in the week. I'm Don Kettl. I'm moderating this session today, and I'm retired from the LBJ School, but my wife is not convinced that it's really taken yet. So really what it means is I get a chance to be able to stay home, do what I want, and rarely have to get dressed up like this. So that's my sort of my definition of retirement here. But I've had a great time over the years having a chance to be able to talk to our guests here today. And we're really talking not only about the fiscal nature and the fiscal future of the country, but more broadly, the issues of economic growth and the kind of country that we're trying to build for 2030, 2040, and 2050 for the lifetimes of many of you who are here. We have been doing with the Concord Coalition, the fiscal wake-up tours for a long time. I had a chance to work with Bob back in 2005. And back at that point, the big question was, could we ever balance the budget? And I was telling Bob before we started here that I followed this pretty closely, and about the middle of last year, it dawned on me, I had no idea, even to the $1 trillion, how much money we were spending. So that the fiscal questions of the future have really become dramatically changed in the last 15 years. Going from the question of how can we balance the budget to whether or not balancing the budget even matters, to the question of the importance of fiscal future, to the question of whether or not fiscal policy even matters anymore, to the question of how are we going to deal with the issues of inflation, to does the fiscal side of the budget have anything that can really be done to try to bring inflation under control. The issue is not only here in the United States, of course. If you follow the news in Britain at all, we know that the government there fell largely on the basis of economic issues. When we talk about inflation here, inflation there is actually worse, as it is in many other countries. So that the issues that we're talking about not only have to do with the United States, but also with the UK and large parts of the rest of the world here as well. And so what we want to do is spend some time today talking about these issues, talking about the issues of what the future looks like, how we're going to try to get to the future, and how we try to make the future different from the kind of the metaphor that I've got here. I just sort of had to hobble in with my cane here, with thanks to all of you who contribute to Medicare every year. I'm working on trying to get used to my brand new titanium hip. So I want to thank all of you who are contributing on a regular basis for that. But I'm a metaphor for what it is that the future looks like, because there are a lot more of me that in some ways the best way to make money is to be an orthopedic surgeon working on hip replacements. And so the question is, what will the future look like? How are we going to try to deal with the issues of economic growth? What role can policymakers play in trying to shape that? And what, in general, can we expect in terms of growth for the future? To be able to shape this conversation, as I said, we're joined by a terrific group of experts here. Bob Bixby sitting right to my right, and he's the Executive Director of the Concord Coalition, which has been working on these issues for a very long time, and which has been one of the best voices, not only in Washington, but across the country in talking about the important issues of the government's fiscal future. Sitting next to Bob is Will Marshall, and Will Marshall is the president and founder of the Progressive Policy Institute in Washington, which is more than just another think tank. The kind of thoughts that they've had have shaped policy through the last several decades, and it's been an incredibly important voice in trying to shape the debate over what it is that the government ought to look like. And then, of course, many of you know Jamie Galbraith, who is here, and a professor and the Lloyd Benson Chair in Government and Business Relations here at LBJ. And Jamie's been working on issues not only on Capitol Hill, but also in his role here at LBJ as a professor. So we're in for, I know, a real treat. We'll have time at the end for questions. So please jot your questions down as you go. But first, let me turn it over to Bob Bixby.
Thank you. My microphone, are we doing okay?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, the point is not so much to depress anybody with some challenges of the future, But to talk about, to be candid about what some of those challenges are, with the hope that we will adopt some public policies that can respond to them, so we would have a brighter future. So that having been said, that the goal is how do we get a brighter future than is portended by some of the economic and budgetary trends that we see. That's really the point, particularly the public policy school, because that's, you know, the nature of the beast here, to try to come up with some public policies that deal with major challenges. So as Don mentioned, the Concord Coalition has been around for a while now. It's actually our 30th year. And the organization is really associated with worrying about the federal debt and deficits. But I want to put that in context because, you know, really the issue is about the long-term economic growth. And the reason that we're worried about budgets and deficits and that sort of thing is that if you have a budget that's on an unsustainable path, we think that that's bad for the long-term prospects of the economy. And so the budget deficit is not just an abstract thing for us, but it's just how does it fit into the economic picture. So that's why I think today's focus is important, which is looking at the long term. We often look at short-term things, it's understandable. We look at whatever is right in our face. If you're driving somewhere, you have to keep your eyes on the road. But it also has you also need to know where you're going. That's the sense of where you're going. So we need to look ahead to some of the challenges that will face the economic future. I'd like to focus primarily on three, and maybe mostly it'll be on two, but the challenges that I would put out there are population aging. Number one, that's going to have a profound effect on the economy and the budget. And as Don mentioned, you know, some of us are living examples of this phenomenon of population aging. Second one I would mention is, and related, is the challenge of rising healthcare costs. There, it's not just a matter of counting the numbers and the number of increased beneficiaries, but it's really the provision of healthcare costs and, you know, how efficiently we're doing it, how inefficiently we may be doing it. We have a very expensive healthcare system in the United States. And I think that finding a better way to deliver healthcare is going to be a big challenge as well. And the third, which is related to the first two, is the federal budget challenge and the rising debt. Because what you find with the budget is that it's basically driven by healthcare and retirement. And those things, you know, increase as the population ages. And so there's a structural underlying situation with the budget that on autopilot we run bigger and bigger deficits, and so we're going to have to face some hard choices there on spending and on taxes. The other thing, and the fourth and final challenge that I mentioned, is something that I know very little about. So I'm not going to talk a lot about it, but I know it's out there, and that's climate change. You know, 30 years ago when the Concord Coalition started, we knew about climate change. Paul Thongas, one of our co-founders, was a big advocate of environmental policy. But basically, it was thought of as an existential threat to the environment, to the planet, and it still is. But along the way, before we ever get there, it's going to be a growing challenge to the economy and to the budget. And so I think now you're beginning to see, both at the federal level and from international organizations, a lot of work going into climate change as an economic and budgetary matter. And I would urge you all to keep that in mind for something to look into. Like I said, it's an emerging issue, and so some of the other things are have some uncertainties about them, and the long-term projections. And climate change probably has even more than others, but it's something that we need to keep an eye on. So let me go back and take a swing at some of these things in a little bit more detail, and let me focus on population change, because as I said, that's going to have just a profound impact on the budget and the economy. So the economy grows with a growing workforce and growing productivity. And when the population ages, as it does, and we have a slowing workforce growth, let me just say that the Congressional Budget Office isn't the first really depressing statistic for you. The Congressional Budget Office projects that economic growth, forget about what's going to happen in the next couple of years, but over the next 10 to 30 years, is going to slow to under 2% a year by the 2030s and 2040s. It's like 1.4%, something like that, 1.3% real economic growth a year, where we're used to it being over 2.5 to even 3% real economic growth. So you look at that and you say, wow, well, CBO must be really, why are they such gloomy guesses on the economy? And really, most of the reason is because the workforce growth is going to slow to just about nothing. I mean, workforce growth is, since 1990, I think the average has been about 1% a year. What CBO is saying is, and they're not alone on this. I mean, everybody who looks at the numbers says that workforce growth will slow to around 0.3%. So roughly by about 2/3 growth. And that is what has such a profound effect on the potential economic growth. Productivity is also another factor. An aging population can have damaging effects on productivity as well. And so you put those two things together. CBO is not pessimistic, by the way, on productivity. But when you look at the two things together, those are the challenges. How do you mitigate the slowing of the workforce growth? How do you boost productivity so we can have an economy anywhere near what we have had in the past? I have a couple of thoughts on the public policy issues on what do you do about the population? The most obvious one is we need to improve immigration. We need to bring in people. There's a big need for immigration, and ironically, that's been falling. At the same time, our population growth has been falling. It should be doing the opposite. And by the way, the population growth, why is it falling? It's declining fertility. It's not so much aging baby boomers. It's really the workforce of the future isn't being born in enough numbers. And to just give you, a sense of that, the so-called total fertility rate of kind of an average measure of births per woman used to be around 2% from the 90s to around the Great Recession, 2008. We were more than the so-called replacement rate of around 2.5%, 2.1%. We've gone now below 2%. We did during the Great Recession. The interesting thing from a demographer's point of view is that it didn't come back. Fertility often falls in big depressions or recessions, but it hasn't come back. It's remained at around 1.7, really historic lows. I mean, that's a prescription for a declining population. And so this is maybe a second depressing statistic that you can remember from CBO, because it crystallizes things. By 2043, just roughly in about 20 years, there'll be more deaths in this country than births. And that means that for the workforce to grow and for the population to grow, we're going to need net immigration. So we're going to need a lot of it. So whatever problems people have with immigration, we better get them worked out because we're going to need them. Two quick things. Another thing that we probably should do is encourage workers to stay in the workforce longer, provided that they're physically able to do so.
Well, Don's trying.
I'm doing all I can.
Yeah, that's right. And so, we can take advantage of, keeping people in the workforce. And we can adopt some family-friendly policies that help people get into the workforce. Why are people having fewer children? Maybe they find it very difficult to start families and and have careers. So we need to look at things like subsidized childcare and tax credits and things like that. Help help families, help people start families. But I think there's probably something more going on than just that difficulty of starting families. I think there's probably some cultural shifts there. And so we can encourage people to stay in the workforce longer, encourage people to get into the workforce. But I think net immigration is probably going to be the key there. I don't know where I am in terms of my 15 minutes.
We've got about 3 or 4 minutes left.
Okay. So, in that remaining 3 or 4 minutes, let me just say that I think that the federal budget deficit is going to be a problem, and let me just explain why. Is that the dynamic in the federal budget is that much of the spending is on autopilot through programs like Medicare, Social Security. Much of that is geared to what we've just been talking about, healthcare costs and demographics. So on autopilot, the spending gets bigger and bigger every year. Revenues get bigger too, but they don't quite keep up. And so every year you get a growing debt to GDP ratio. Now, you can expect higher debt when we have something like a pandemic or a war or depression or something like that. You would say it's natural and right that the budget deficit and the debt should go up. The problem that I see that we've got here is we have a debt that's perpetually rising without any real point. I mean, it's not like it's trying to achieve a particular goal. It's just that we haven't made any tough choices on how we want to finance our future. So we've been benefiting from that. We've been benefiting from low interest rates for the last 20 years or so. It's made it very cheap for the federal budget to be financed. And so a lot of people like me that said this is going to be ruinous if we get this much debt have been proven wrong because we were able to finance it with such low interest rates. What's happening now, though, is that when interest rates normalize and you're taking on all that debt, it's going to become much more expensive to finance that debt. So I think we need to develop some plans for the federal budget that would make it more sustainable without perpetually growing debt over the long term. And that would make it hopefully easy to do some of these other things that we're going to have to do, like invest in climate change and healthcare, which are the last 2 things I mentioned, and I won't have time to talk about that, but maybe we can get into the Q&A. So, I probably am not going to be the one that depresses you now.
Terrific, but thanks so much, Bob. And I think that the issues about what to do and how to try to manage especially the issues of fertility have to do with basic social issues. There was this big decline after the Great Recession, but signs now that as more people, especially more women, were working at home, that maybe the birth rate picked up just a little bit. So there may be some signs that we can go into, I think, in the questions and answers.
Yeah, I hope somebody say that.
Yep. Will Marshall from the Progressive Policy Institute.
Thanks, hi, everybody. First, let me thank you all for organizing this. It's great to see you guys after I haven't seen you for many years, but I've seen Don more recently. But 3 people I admire and have worked with on and off over the decades. So it's great to be with you all. And congratulations on 30 years of the Concord Coalition, sounding the alarm.
We could have gone out of business.
And good years and bad. I mean, as I said to one of your colleagues here, this is a cyclical issue. It comes in and it comes out. It'll come back around. Just you wait long enough. But I have to say, in 2 ways, you've been unfair to me. One, you've asked me to speak about what would get the long-term growth picture looking more promising for the United States. I'm not an economist. At PPI range broadly in sort of a demagogue without portfolio, but I will do my best to channel what we think at PPI on the economy. I'll try to be, and the other is that you've asked me to be the optimist on the panel because I gather I think you can have some sobering news for us all too. So that's a natural role for Democrats. So, but I'll try to be the cockeyed optimist that I'm usually am not. So a couple of things. It seems to me that the answer to the question, the canoe above laid out it lies in accelerating innovation and productivity, or as you economists would say, total factor productivity in the United States. This is, you would say that. But in any event, this is America's secret sauce. This is what we do best. Entrepreneurial innovation is how we invent the modern parts of the economy and how we get comparative advantages in global competition. It's how it's how we will stay ahead of the Chinese, which I'm increasingly confident we will do with this return to the totalitarianism that we're seeing in Beijing now. But the point is, yes, we do have demographic challenges. I'm with you in thinking that immigration is going to be part of the answer. And I don't think we're going to keep folks out. We never have. It's been a pretty damn leaky policy and situation. And I think we will find a way to get the workers we need through a combination of immigration. Who knows, maybe some dataless policies. But I think, economically speaking, we need to focus on public investment, private investment. Now, that's something Democrats don't talk about. We always want to spend lots of money. We want to do industrial policy, and we want to do infrastructure. And we've just done a lot of that with Joe Biden, by the way. A lot of smart public investment. But we don't talk as much about private investment. I do want to talk about that because that's actually a bigger driver of innovation. And so we need to attend to that, as particularly on my side of the political aisle. And then secondly, I want to talk about the other great challenge which we see, and that is to spread the prosperity, to spread the innovation and growth more evenly across the landscape, and to create a much more robust system of preparing people who don't have college degrees to get high-paying, high-skilled jobs in this economy that's going to continue to be skill biased. And so that's not going to end. And we're not going to go back and get the older manufacturing economy back, which is not happening. But we can get digital manufacturing, but everybody's going to have higher level skills. We need a system that produces that across the labor force. So first, just on the economic change, well, how are we going to speed up innovation? Well, let's look at where it's already happening. In this, looking at the last century, America's big industrial giants were also the innovation leaders in the global economy. Companies like GM, GE, Eastman Kodak, IBM, you might remember them. They used to dominate the commanding heights of the American economy. They created most of the jobs, but they also were the innovation leaders, created new products that were emulated all over the world. Obviously, manufacturing employment peaked in 1979, and since then it's been a drag on U.S. jobs. Now the tech leadership has moved over to what we call the innovation leadership has moved over to what we call the tech e-commerce sectors, the internet-based economy. It's e-commerce, it's software, it's everything that all those big tech companies that everybody loves to hate does. Apple, Alphabet, Microsoft, Facebook, Amazon, these are the equivalents to those big industrial giants of the past. They're also our top creators. And I think that fact has been lost in Washington, where all these populists on both ends of the spectrum want to break them up and severely regulate them. But we looked closely at the BLS statistics here, and the companies in this tech e-commerce space have generated more than 1.2 million net new jobs between 2016 and 2020, including the pandemic. They continued their job growth during the pandemic. And that's kind of common sense if you were there and lived through it. What were you all doing on Amazon, ordering everything you needed, right? Or some other, using some other online service because you couldn't go and do stuff. So that job growth has been a remarkable factor. That's the biggest job growth in the American economy by sector, eclipsing healthcare, which is the next biggest, with about 700,000 new jobs. And the average pay in this sector is about 44% higher than the average pay across the private sector, and 21% higher than manufacturing. So I do ask, my fellow Democrats in Washington, why are we sort of obsessing with the factory economy of old and claiming we can bring it back through a combination of Buy America policies and industrial policies and maintaining tariffs. We're going to revive the factory economy. We're not. It's going to be, we are going to have a digital manufacturing sector. And we think that holds great promise for being geographically spread out, a kind of deconcentration of the old industrial model. But that doesn't mean we're going to have the kind of high scale employment in those sectors that we had in the manufacturing, probably not. So I think there's good news in the economy. Again, in these innovation-driven sectors, we're generating lots of great jobs. They are high-wage jobs, and I mean across the spectrum, the top, middle, and bottom. And down in these fulfillment centers at Amazon, and the base wage is $15 an hour. It's the minimum wage we tried to legislate a couple of years back and couldn't get through Congress. And that's just the entry-level wage. So if you're down in, say, rural Alabama, where we had a big unionization drive recently, got a lot of attention. That's competitive with the manufacturing economy offered you, and so it's beginning to be the case. We're seeing new opportunities for production, so jobs. Spread across the landscape in this sector too. It's not all software engineers and people who graduated from
UT.
UT. Thanks. I was searching for Stanford, but so this is also something that's demographically spread. This phenomenon, Black workers are a bigger share of the tech e-commerce sector than they are in manufacturing. We still have problems with women. They're laggards in this sector. We got to work on that. And we have problems with Latinos. Hispanic workers tend to be still more concentrated in the old industrial sector. But one last point on this, and that is, how did all this happen? What happened to it happened to private investment? It didn't happen, frankly, to industrial policies coming out of Washington. They can be helpful or hurtful, but they didn't drive it. So every year PPI puts out a study called the Investment Heroes Report. And we just had this idea about 10 years ago to say, okay, who's really investing in America? Which corporations are putting the most money, laying the biggest bets on America's future? And we actually thought that, our party has fallen into a bad habit of bashing the private sector now. And when you listen to a Bernie Sanders or listen to AOC, what you hear is basically the private sector cast in the role of the villain or the enemy, which is nonsense. But the point is, these companies, nobody says good job to the companies that actually do what you want them to do. Invest big time in the American economy, pay their workers above average wages. And so again, we looked at these 9 of the 11 of the leaders on in our investment hero list for this last year. We're in this tech broadband sector. They've been expanding capacity, and that's great. There's another advantage. When you expand capacity, that means you don't have to raise prices as much. It means that you're ready for the surge in demand that we've experienced. And so this is also the low inflation sector of the U.S. economy. Prices are low. Broadband prices have been falling, and across this whole spectrum of industries, prices are low. Of course, some of these prices are free, right? When you're getting online services like search, and so it's kind of no accident. This is kind of economics 101. I trust that when private companies invest, do robust capital investment and capacity expansion, they create jobs, good jobs, and they reap productivity gains, which make them more resilient against the kind of surge in inflation that we're now suffering from. Better able to hold the line and not raise prices. So, let's build out from this beachhead that these companies have. Let's figure out how we can get more. I think we're on the verge of a big expansion in biotech. That will look maybe similar to what we've seen in the digitalization of the economy from all the companies that I've talked about. Advanced robotics takes it into the digital space, into the manufacturing space. You can digitize the old physical economy. You'll begin to get the kind of productivity gains that can beat the odds and give you a higher productivity gains, higher wages, better job growth over time. Last point, you've got to do the human capital side of this challenge, and this is something we're spending a lot of time on at TPI. This is maybe not the most popular message to offer on the college campus, but I'll do it anyway. The United States at the federal level, at the state level, and probably at the local level, but certainly at the federal and state level, public policy is biased in favor of college-going youth, like my kids, like me, like everybody in this room. That is, the federal government spends over $200 billion a year to help assist people who are college going. It spends about $16 billion a year on job training, career preparation, career pathways, apprenticeship, all the things aimed at non-college workers. This is a huge glaring inequity in our country. And I am sorry to say that our president just compounded this inequity by the student loan default idea. Yeah, I'm glad to get some heads nodding in this room, but this is not the group that needs the most help in our society right now. And what we don't have is a robust system of upskilling and reskilling and job connection, career pathways is sort of the shorthand for workforce development policies, school to work transitions. We don't have a robust program because we don't invest in it. Because we fell into this kind of paradigm of college for all, and Democrats for the last 5 or 6 years have been talking about, let's get everybody into college. Well, we're not going to get everybody into college. 62% of the people out there don't have 4-year degrees, and they don't want it. There was a recent poll in California that asked people, what's the path ahead for you? And, about by 2/3, they said it's, getting the kind of quick and inexpensive access to skills that will lead to middle income jobs, not getting on the 4-year track to a BA and then beyond. That's not what people are wanting out there. And yet we always come back to that, and we underinvest, we starve this sector. I'll just give you, we have a whole panoply of ideas for rectifying this, but one is on apprenticeship. And we have about 500,000 registered apprentices in the United States. This is frankly pathetic. It's a small number, it hasn't grown much over the years, confined mostly in old industrial sectors. Unions are, to their credit, organize a lot of this activity. But it's about 1/10 of what the British have, the Australians have, the Germans have. They have much bigger apprenticeship sectors. So while we're doing all this big spending in Washington, we think we should devote some of that to huge increase, tenfold increase in the number of apprentices in America, but not doing it in the traditional way, not just generally through the usual big companies and the old industrial companies and the industrial unions, but this model focuses on intermediaries, private intermediaries, nonprofits, for-profit companies, job placement companies, corporate services companies, nonprofits. A huge number of nonprofits are increasingly getting into this space. What we need to do is give them a public incentive to create robust apprenticeships that are connected to that connect them to employers for all the job training and to the learning organizations for the classroom skills that they need. And when they graduate from this and get a job, those intermediaries get an incentive from the government. If they fail, if they don't create a robust apprenticeship that leads to a good job, they don't get paid. It's a paid for performance kind of system. So that's that's just one example of many things we need to do to end the bias in public policy against non-college workers. And I'll end on this note because it's really a political hack. It's important to me. Our party, the Democrats, are we're looking at a tough outcome in this election, and but structurally we can't build big, durable governing majorities and turn this country in a progressive direction if we don't do better with non-college voters. It's just that simple. The math points to that, and no wonder we're not doing well with them when our whole economic paradigm is organized around what college educated workers and professionals think are the right policies. So we have to do a big shift in our thinking to solve the country's growth problems, but also to help move it in a more progressive direction.
That's terrific. Well, thanks much. And we'll come back maybe in the questions that ask whether or not Austin is a sign of what it is that you're prescribing for the future, or whether it really represents some of the problems as well. The combination of Tesla and Samsung mega investments, along with Alphabet and Google and all the rest. Housing has gotten less affordable,
Yeah.
and it's gotten, we've had increasing challenges of inequality, even with the kind of growth that we're talking about.
Yeah.
So something we'll want to come back to. Jamie.
Michael. No, I'm sorry.
Well, thanks very much, Don, and let me add a word of welcome to my friends Bob and Will. It's good to have you here, and it's great to be having this discussion. And I'm going to take it in a slightly different direction. I will complement some of what is being said already. I'll begin by stating what I think is fairly obvious, which is that things are changing quite quickly and not for the better. The pandemic has exposed the instability of our services-based employment structure, and also the fragility of supply chains. The war, and in fact, all the recent wars going back 20 years, underscored the limits of military power. The outlook in the energy sector, which underpins just about everything else, is murky, and with it, the prospect for inflation. And inflation that we're experiencing is largely driven by the rising cost of energy. What will happen going forward is at the moment extremely unclear. Climate change, as I've already been said, is in fact underway, and how we respond to it and how effectively is an open question. With all of that said, I think it's fair to say that the core concepts that we use to think about these questions in economics, whether one starts with something as simple as supply and demand, or something as structured as our national income accounts or metrics of GDP, and also, for instance, productivity and that sort of thing. The so-called trade-off between inflation and employment, rules about the budget or about monetary policy. All of these things were framed in a different era. They were framed from the late 18th century through the middle of the 20th century. They all presume a basically self-contained national, or if you like, imperial economy. Sorry, should I be speaking more loudly? Okay, good. Sorry, I see at the end of baleful and imperialist affairs, and I thought, but I'm not projecting properly. Anyway, the idea is that there is an economy which either tends toward a state of balance and equilibrium, or at worst has a growth that can be managed by public policy, which is a lot of what we're engaged with here at the LBJ School. They also presume that the system is perhaps superior to any competing alternatives in the world, or at least if there is an alternative, that the two are independent of each other, that one does not really affect the other. And this was not an unreasonable assumption in the first Cold War. There are models that flatter a certain self-image, which I think was fair to say was originally British. It arises in the era of Victorian self-confidence of the British Empire, but it was even more effectively projected around the world by the United States after the Second World War. It's an image which is small r Republican, small d democratic, modern, industrial, and efficient. And the reality is the moment something else. And I would say for practically my entire professional life, the conditions that enabled this self-image have been slipping away. There are many suitable words: globalization, financialization, militarism, imperialism, overreach, hubris are words that come to mind. The underlying economic process was well known to Adam Smith. It is specialization and the division of labor, which is in the global sense benign enough if you're talking about trade of one type of good for another, but becomes somewhat more ambiguous, difficult when you're talking about the division of major economic functions. And in the world in which we have come to live over the past 40 or 50 years, the United States has reserved financial control through the dollar system, the use of the dollar as the international reserve, military control through bases, ships, bombers, and other pieces of equipment, and technological control, mainly through leadership in information technologies, communications, things that Will was just talking about. But resources and industry, by and large, have gone elsewhere. And with the loss of industry, infrastructure, and the engineering and mechanical prowess of the working population has eroded, and taking with them the long-term sustainability of advantages in the military sphere and increasingly in advanced technologies. So that's the present situation, I think, that we're facing as a result of the developments since really the late 1970s is probably a reasonable starting point. And further, awkward though it is to acknowledge it, it's not actually the case that the United States, that we as Americans enjoy some unique genius of economic organization. Will was talking about the Great American Industrial Corporation, which was a central feature of my father's work in the 1950s and 1960s. Well, I walked along Dean Keaton on my way here and looked at the cars that are parked there, and I saw a couple of Chevys and a couple of Fords, but everything else came from somewhere. And the fact is that innovation of the Great Industrial Corporation, which was a very distinctive American thing, has migrated. And it is greatly weakened here, but it continues to exist in Japan, in the Republic of Korea, in the People's Republic of China. And I would add also, it has emerged in a slightly altered form, certainly in Germany, but also in a slightly altered form in the last several decades in Russia. In these countries, one observes the emergence or the re-emergence of industrial power built on a very large resource base and sustaining the engineering mindset and the technical disciplines that don't characterize the elites in the United States. And again, Will made this point, but college-educated elites, lawyers, business managers, medical professionals, of course, they're different character of thing. They are technical, but they're very specialized in a particular area. Now, this university is an exception, I think, amongst many as having a very strong engineering and physics and scientific component, but this is not characteristic of the American system as we now see it. And it's not characteristic of the general population, almost all of whom in the last 30 or 40 years are employed in the services sectors. So I have to ask sort of what is happening out there in the world. And in particular, I want to say a word or two about how we perceive the challenge from China, which I think we have to a substantial extent misconstrued. We tend to view it as an attempt to evolve toward our present position, which is to say, to displace us as the dominant financial and military power. But this presumes that the status that the United States presently holds is viewed by China or any other country that may be considered a rival as the desirable end state. And I don't think that's correct. I think outside the US, so far as I've been able to observe, this is not the prevailing view. I think rather that others see our financial position as serving mainly a small and not very desirable elite in the United States with extremely predatory and destabilizing tendencies, as evidenced in the great financial crisis and maybe what's coming down the pike right now. They see military position as an asset which is intrinsically a wasting asset, not something that you could sustain, destructive of reputation and unsustainable as technologies evolve against whatever the predominant military. And so the goal is not to supplant the United States as a pillar, inevitably a decaying pillar of a unipolar world order, but to eliminate the conditions that support unipolarity. And this, if it succeeds, which I strongly suspect it will, it can only heighten the political and social divisions inside this country by deepening the conflicts that we all see that are part of the polarization that have become the, so to speak, most prevalent piece of our national experience at the present time. So you can watch this happening around the world. You can see it happening in Pakistan. You can see it happening in Western Central Africa, South America, even Sri Lanka and other places right now. This kind of process. And unfortunately for the United States, our own position in economic, political, and moral terms as an exemplar for the world is far weaker now than it was in the First Cold War. In the First Cold War, we really did hold a position to which much of the rest of the world saw as the model. That was expressed by American national leaders in a way which was effective outside the country, and I don't think that's the case now. So we are, of course, reacting to this, and we have to ask, are we reacting to it in an effective way? I don't want to take a lot of time on this, but I'll just cite one example, which is the most recent salvo from the Biden administration, which was aimed at the semiconductor sector in China. By most accounts that I've read, they did do some damage, maybe some serious damage by withholding the most advanced semiconductor technologies from China. Because this is something the U.S. and certain partners, the Netherlands and others, do control. But consider the Biden White House just last year did a very good report on supply chain issues. And in analyzing this sector, it pointed out China is 1/2 of the world market for semiconductors. And if that market goes away, what you're doing is cutting U.S. companies, the most advanced ones, from the funds that they require for research and investment. This was the judgment of the administration in its own internal research as of early summer before last. Now, those funds can be replenished to some extent by public subsidies. And that's, in fact, I think what the administration's bill seeks to do. But then I have to ask, how is this really different from a state-directed technology sector, from a command economy? And by what mechanism will we actually ensure the requisite degree of performance and avoid the stagnation into which command economies are prone to fall? I guess my own sense is, good luck with that. And if we do not quite succeed, then we are not going to be able to deal with the cost pressures that come from this sector. And as I said before, the cost pressures that come from the energy sector will depend in part on geology and part on control of production. These are matters that we don't have a clear sense of right now, but we'll see. That's where I think, to come to the inflation question, we're going to find that we're facing the most difficulties. So I'll just conclude briefly. The conclusion I would draw is that whether globalization was a good or a bad thing to begin with, it cannot now be undone without severe economic losses, especially in a country, our country, which has depleted its resources to a substantial extent and allowed core manufacturing and the organizations that made core manufacturing successful here to slip away into leadership by other countries. Nor can the outsized power of American finance be maintained indefinitely. I don't think that the dollar reserve system is about to collapse. There are some people who have argued that, but I think that's an ambitious claim. But at the same time, systems of international currency and financial hegemony don't last forever. The British pound did not dominate forever. One can go back. This is not a pattern which which has complete permanence to it. So how should we proceed? I think it would be wise to begin to resolve some of the issues that have the imbalances in our own economy in order to be able to adapt to the kind of world that is coming to us. That is to say, in particular, to bring the financial sector under control as it was from the 1930s into the 1970s with effective regulatory structure and a much more equal distribution of income and wealth, and to pull back from the unsustainable ambitions that we had in the global sphere and to make peace effectively with the powers that now exist and will continue to exist in the world outside. And so to build and preserve what I'd like to call, to borrow a phrase, moderately prosperous, peaceful, secure, and relatively egalitarian middle-class society of the kinds that I once imagined actually existed, and I think it did exist to a large degree. And in the wider world, a commitment to the coexistence in recognition that we're going to have to live in the world in which power is much more widely distributed than it has been in recent decades or than we imagined it would be. Thank you very much.
Terrific, thank you. This has been a great series of presentations, and I think beforehand there was some discussion about whether or not this would be incredibly depressing. And actually, as I'm sitting here listening, I find it incredibly stimulating because I think each of our speakers here has talked about the need to try to rethink the way in which we're going at things, to try to develop new governmental capacity, new governmental strategies, but new strategies that involve the private sector as well in a very interesting kind of way, in a way that I think would have been, frankly, was different than the original 2005 fiscal wake-up tour conversation that we had. And we'll have time for questions, but I want to kick things off as you think about the questions you want to raise with this question about the tools and about the capacity of government, and about trying to figure out in particular what is the government ought to do. Let me try to frame that just with three quick examples. The first, going back to my own case, how can we avoid my personally bankrupting the country? My hip replacement cost over $100,000.
How can we avoid what, Don?
My personally bankrupting the country, and others like me who are of roughly the same age.
I'm sorry, bankrupted who?
Bankrupting the country.
The country.
The country. Healthcare. Because my hip replacement was over $100,000. And I want to thank all of you who are contributing every month to that. But that's a lot of money. And I'm not alone. The second thing is that as we talk about immigration, as Bob did, one of the things that we have is a problem of governmental capacity on this issue. And it turns out that my favorite trivia question for the day is how many people work for the Office of Refugee Resettlement that is in charge of dealing with that? And anybody have a guess? You know, it's a trick question. The answer is 100. So we've got thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of immigrants coming into the country, and the agency that's in charge of trying to deal with the immigration question that Bob suggests is that we have just 100 people who are in charge of managing that. And they're managing it through a vast network of nonprofits and some for-profit organizations, but mostly nonprofits. The third point on climate change is that the great city of Austin in the last several years has issued boil water notices 3 times. And most of these have to do with climate change kinds of issues. So the question is, as we look at these kind of puzzles, my question for our speakers is, I mean, how do we deal with the basic underlying question of the governmental tools and capacity? I mean, it's clear to me from what each of the speakers is saying that we need to think about government in a different kind of way as we move forward, not as a kind of taxing and spending kind of entity, but as some kind of catalytic action force that is designed to try to make some of this stuff happen. So who wants to add that one first?
Well, it would be good if the government responded to these problems first. For example, I don't know what can be done about your hip. Don't have another one. But this is the problem, that we're gonna be spending more in healthcare, and the question then is, how can the government encourage a more efficient healthcare system? Whereas right now, it's pretty much, the fee-for-service system in Medicare and subsidizing private health insurance by, that's making it tax deductible for businesses, encourages more spending, rather than what you're spending it on, quantity over quality, and somehow transforming the medical system so that Don Kettl still gets his hip replacement, but it doesn't cost so much. It's going to require some difficult choices because, other countries do a much better job of controlling healthcare costs than we do. We're a notoriously expensive healthcare system, and it doesn't generate any better results. And so what we need, but the one thing that they do in other countries is that they do impose some limits that we don't hear. There are budgetary limits and things like that. So the question, as we try to transform to a more efficient healthcare system, is, can we accept limits? Paul Tsongas used to joke that this is the only country in the world that considers death to be an option. So, as we try to have a more efficient healthcare system, I think that's really the key. And I'd like to have the government take on that, because what the government does through Medicare, Medicaid, the rules that the government sets has a profound effect on the rest of the healthcare system. So it could really be a leader there.
I've had to, one other factoid, the Medicare and Medicaid combined amount to about 25% of the entire federal budget. The number of people who are in charge of managing those programs is under 5,000. So there are, the University of Texas employs about 25,000 people. So 1/5 of the Texas University of Texas employment is in charge of managing 25% of the entire federal budget. So the challenge is trying to figure out how to manage it. Really does get to the question.
We really need more bureaucrats.
It's a question of more bureaucrats, different kind of bureaucrats. We may, to be able to make some of this pivot, we might need different kinds of people.
I'm being facetious, but let me just, because you're making a very good point here. There's a huge immigration backlog. There's like I think it's like 8.5 million. But it's just waiting for simple documents, green cards, or just having their applications processed. And that's because and I was talking to a conservative think tank person who was saying we needed to process these people, and the way to do it is to hire more people for the agency to do that. So I mean, there's a very conservative person who wouldn't be talking about hiring more federal employees, but that's the way that that's a good trade-off. Yes, so sometimes the number of people you have processing stuff, we're going to have to re-look at the federal workforce.
I think that's right.
And then like it's the IRS thing.
Yeah, it's the same kind of thing. It's by cutting IRS, we're actually cutting down the amount of money we're bringing in. Jamie.
And we should have more than one like that.
When the question of healthcare comes up, I always think about a remark that was made to me many years ago by the very distinguished economist Paul Sanderson, who said that at the time, I think the number was 15%. He said healthcare is 15% of GDP, and it's the best 15% of American GDP. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. But the problem, which has already been mentioned here, to state it clearly, is insurance. The problem is insurance, and the problem is that we have this jerry-built system of private insurance intended to support a network of private insurance companies, their executives, their stockholders, as profit centers, as an extension of the financial sector, the FIRE sector. This is something which other countries dispense with and manage to deliver pretty good quality health care without the paperwork and without the, without the fuss and the bother and without the rejections and all the other things, although they do have other problems. But I remember getting sick and passing through Heathrow and being shipped out to a British hospital. And in 90 minutes, I was checked out, discharged, handed a slip of paper with my name on it that said I was from Austin, Massachusetts, which gave you a sense of your sense of geography. And that was it. No bill, no further record of. Whereas what would happen if you stop at an emergency room here. The bills keep coming in bits and pieces for weeks. So this is the problem that we have, and it's a political problem. It's a problem that could be solved by extending Medicare to the whole population with a modest increase in the 5,000 running it. But if you didn't want to do that, the simplest thing, in my view, is to take the 65 and change the 6 to a 5, so it's Medicare at 55. And then you would take a lot of people, all of us are past that point, but some of you are not, who are in that decade when healthcare begins to become costly. And they would come under the Medicare system, and that would make it much cheaper for employers to finance insurance for younger people. That's a healthy goal. So the ways of doing this, but we just haven't really. Well, why don't we do it? Because the political system is blocked up on this question. That's very straightforward. I want to come back to the question of bankruptcy very briefly, because I think it's a very. I was pretending not to hear Don use this word to describe the government or the country. Bankruptcy is a legal proceeding which allows private individuals to escape from debts. It is not something that applies to the government of the United States. Why? Because the Constitution of the United States says that the debts of the United States are not to be questioned. Right? And that's been true since the end of the Civil War. So the United States will pay its debts. It can have other problems. Inflation is a problem. Unemployment is a problem. General mismanagement and inequality are problems. But not being able to pay is not a problem.
Well,
Yeah, sure. Well, this question of state government is one we think about a lot, going back to our reinventing government days, because frankly, there's minimal high regard for government. There's minimal high regard among voters in the federal government's capacity right now. 19% of the Americans say they trust their government to do.
Keep government out of my Medicare line.
Yeah, but they don't believe it's going to do great things. Okay, so you have a real problem if you're one of these big spending progressives who think that you're going to turn everything public and socialize everything. You know, the dogs don't like the dog food. Okay, the customers out there are telling you that they have no faith in the federal government's ability to deliver, and they're right. If you want my opinion, there are certain people in Washington. I'm not going to name any names, but one of them's from Massachusetts, who are saying that, well, you know, the federal government, the IRS, should take over the job of doing your taxes every year. This is the same IRS that can't answer more than 1/3 of the telephone calls that come into it, and that's just answering the call, solving the problems way below that. That you know, 2/3 of the people who call the IRS don't get their call, your call answered. And if they're going to do my taxes, now I want somebody I can talk to there. So we have a jaundiced view about the federal capacity to do much of anything these days. It's so captive of a myriad of conflicting and overlapping interests. Everything is mired in the sludge of too many laws and too many regulations. This is not where I look for public sector creativity. Where I look for public sector creativity is here, the metro level. I just happen to know the mayor and talk to him. You know, it's the metro leaders who have scope, who have the ability to conserve resources, who are doing a lot more of the ground up solving of our toughest problems like homeless housing, or attacking it. It's really hard to solve. For your problem, I mean, innovation is going to play a role. Well, gene splicing is going to help us find cheaper ways to deal with your hip problem down the road. But the simple way to deal with the healthcare cost problem, with respect, is not to Medicare for all and suddenly turn it all over to Washington, is to cap spending. We just did that with prescription drugs, right? And we're Biden has done it. You put a cap on spending. This is what other countries do. Other countries have hybrid public and private provision of their healthcare systems, but they cap they cap costs. So let's cap costs, but that's what we propose. And, there's ways to do it. Basically benchmarking it off Medicare reimbursement rates and do it in a declining way that can create incentives to move the whole system away from fee for service, which is kind of a structural driver in inefficiency. But in any event, so I think that there are simpler solutions to the problem facing these wholesale changes that require Washington to take on the job of organizing everybody's healthcare.
But the state capacity question may very well be the thing for the next decade as we go into this. Questions out here? Yes, sir. And as you ask your question, if you could just give your name too.
Tejas Vakil, I'm actually one of the Texas fiscal lookouts for the Concord Coalition. I want the panel to comment on a contrarian position. You read a lot. This has to do with immigration and the falling birth rates, and you read a lot about articles bemoaning the fact that Western Europe and Japan and China and even the US has falling birth rates, and therefore it's going to tank their economies in the future. The contrarian view is that actually that vacuum is being replaced and will be replaced by technology, and therefore we need a different measure of productivity in terms of contributions to the GDP than simply, then simply the contributions of human capital and the contributions of one generation to the previous generation's retirement, that the productivity is actually coming more as a function of the innovation and the technology that some of you have talked about. Will mentioned that the robotics and things of that sort. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, my own view is that it would have to be just an astounding increase in productivity to make up for the decline in population. And I think it would be probably unprecedented. I don't know what the numbers would be, going back into the Industrial Revolution or something like that. But I mean, we're going to need that, because even if we do the sort of big immigration that I'd like to do, there are political limits and practical limits. So we're going to have to we're going to have to hope that the kind of innovations that you're talking about do result in much greater productivity, because it's going to need to be much higher than it's been in the past, even if we do the immigration stuff to make up for a slowing workforce.
Jamie?
On the question of spurring productivity, and this ties also to another point that Will made about the imbalance in our public policy favoring higher educated, college educated over non-college educated populations. If you want to spur productivity, the way to do that is to raise wages. The way to do that is to, if you had, New York and California already have now a $15 minimum wage. You put that in effect more broadly, and employers have to choose. Do they go the route, or do they stay with the route of maintaining a large low wage population, or do they innovate and improve their productivity? This is how Scandinavia got rich in the 20th century, by having a very egalitarian wage structure, which they maintained with an open economy. They didn't have protectionism. But what that meant was that you had to move up the productivity scale in order to maintain the competitiveness of the country. And that's what they did. Well, we have a very relaxed attitude toward this. And I was very pleased to, Will and I probably could get together on a combination of public insurance and price controls. Price controls are a Galbraithian tradition. I asked my father once how he found 17,000 people in a few months to freeze wages and prices in the United States in 1942. And he said, land grant colleges. I hired all the economics to so we're all together on that. But if you could do that, you can also raise wages. And then you say to the employers, well, if you're really good, you'll figure out how to work in this environment and improve your productivity. If you're not so good, well, the market will open up for somebody else. Good luck. That's how a well-regulated system actually moves up the productivity ladder.
Well,
I don't have much to add, except two things. One is that, we would like to see the aperture for legal immigration widen. A lot more people coming in with organized around work. We have an idea for a universal willing worker visa. Take all these alphabet soup visas and put them all together to administratively simplify this thing and try to match willing workers to real job openings in the US economy that, there's been some effort made by the employer to show we can't source the labor locally, for this country. But the other side, you're never going to get there if you don't also constrict the aperture, narrow the aperture for illegal. That's what we don't want to do. And so our party won't do that. The other party, doesn't want to really have a wider legal immigration, no matter what they say. And so we are stuck, and we have a policy that, it doesn't matter how many workers we have an incoherent policy that doesn't make any sense. There's no way to administer it because we don't know what we're trying to achieve. On productivity gains, I would only note that we're seeing big wage gains right now across the U.S. economy. We have 3.5% unemployment. We have, unemployment. We have snare drum type labor markets right now, and we see wages going up. And we actually see wages at the lower ends of the distribution going up faster than at the higher end. So low income people's wages are rising rapidly now. So we're in a period such as we would love to have. I'm not, we don't, I don't know if we're going to get prodigies of productivity growth. They're going to completely offset the demographic learn. But we want to get the most we can get. But of course, we have this little problem called inflation, and it's tied, frankly, to public spending, overspending. So yes, there's a connection to, our failure to adhere to some kind of reasonable fiscal discipline standard. I'm no Austerian, but we've got to have a reasonable standard, because I looked at Federal Reserve San Francisco's report out on the contribution made to inflation by overspending, to fight this pandemic recession. And it's real. Larry Summers was right.
No, he wasn't.
That's why I guess it's smart.
we got time for one last quick question.
The best definition I've read of when a nation reaches its credit limit was a nation reaches its credit limit when it becomes counterproductive to print more money. And getting back to the comment just made by Dr. Marshall.
No.
Okay, but I just bestowed an honorary on you.
It's a way that we in Texas express our love.
Anyway, this coupled with the Cantillon effect and the trade of the lower working class folks. I hold the distinction of being a federal budget nerd and a working class guy who was in an economics class when the NAFTA vote was taken. Anyway, I look at those forces, the Cantillon effect, the impact on the working class of the Cantillon effect, and when are we going to, and I think we're seeing the early signs with inflation, which I'll say to people in my novice understanding, that typically what form that counterproductivity takes is in the form of inflation. And it sounds like there's agreement amongst everybody with regard to the inflation up there being a challenge. And I don't believe we can outrun it with productivity or whatever, just y'all's thoughts on that. What would be y'all's definition of the best definition for when a nation reaches its credit limit?
That sounds like an answer for an economics professor.
I'm a professor of public affairs and government. The answer to that is when the rest of the world doesn't wish to hold your debt, which is not a problem that the United States faces right now. On the contrary, the problem that we have is the rest of the world is demanding more of our debt, and the dollar is rising. Europe has that problem. The UK has that problem. The euro is now below the dollar and with no bottom in sight at the moment. The US doesn't have that problem right now. It's a mixed blessing for us that we don't, because it also means that we export our inflation to Europe, which is a cheap way of dealing with some of it. That's what the Fed is doing by raising interest rates. And to the rest of the world, by the way, to Latin America, Dave. So my view is that I agree with you that inflation is a serious problem, but the underlying sources of it are in the energy supply, in the supply chain, some degree in the housing sector. And these need to be dealt with by a serious, let's call it a whole of government effort, to the extent they can be dealt with. To some degree, the energy problem may be a long-term problem. I don't know what the geology is like or what the production is going to be like. And I don't know anybody who is completely confident in the industry. So this is something we may be facing for quite some time. But it's not going to be solved by higher interest rates, except by crushing labor, crushing wages, crushing employment. And generally speaking, transferring income from middle class and working class Americans back to the banking sector, which is just going to aggravate every kind of social division that we presently are experiencing. So it's not the right solution. It's a cop-out on the part of public policy to hand inflation over to the central bank and say, gee, that's not our problem, you deal with it, we'll just worry about the easy stuff.
I do want to take this opportunity to say the one way that is not a definition is a statutory debt limit, which is an insane thing, and we should get rid of it. And I say that as a deficit hog because it doesn't do anything to manage fiscal policy. It just means that Congress is prohibited from paying for the debt that it has owed, which effectively turns Uncle Sam into a deadbeat. And so we have these crises every now and then when the debt limit comes up, and it is not an effective way of managing our debt, but it can be dangerous by forcing a default. So I think that one thing I would hope for the future is we come up with some better way of dealing with that. I wanted to ask Jamie, because one of your comments got me even more depressed when I was thinking about it, and so I want to ask you about that, because you were talking about the future of the dollar. And one of the reasons that you can say, well, the United States is in a better position than, say, Great Britain or somebody else, not to have to worry about their debt so much, is because of the dominance of the dollar as the world currency. But you mentioned that it could be that in some time in the future, the dollar would not be the dominant currency. Would that have, is that something we should worry about in terms of the amount of debt and the long-term debt that we're piling on? Is that some reason to try to bring that into a more sustainable future?
It's an extremely rough, delicate question. Rough and delicate at the same time. My sense of this, and I published something on this last spring, which I'm republishing shortly, is that what we're seeing is the creation of a zone which will not be using the dollar or the euro. And that zone is centered around the Russian Federation, around China, to a degree their trade with India, with Iran, and they're working on settling energy trade, for example, in national currencies. They can do that, but that's not quite the same thing as creating a reserve asset that competes with the dollar, because you don't need a reserve asset if the trade is balanced. The accounts liquidate over a short period of time. If you have unbalanced trade, then you need a financial reserve. And at the moment, there's no suitable alternative. The Chinese currency, the RMB, is the large item, but there's no substantial amount of Chinese debt in the world. And the capital flows are controlled in China thanks to a sensible, pragmatic development policy. The Russian ruble is the currency of one country. And I don't think that's going to be a reserve asset broadly held anytime soon. So, that's, my sense is that for the moment, okay, now I'll come back, since we're close to the end, I always like to close by quoting a possibly apocryphal remark at the end of his life of the Iron Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, who reported to have said that Almighty Providence takes special care of drunks, fools, and the United States of America.
Want to add one point here, and I underscore the link again between private sector investment and inflation. We are seeing, for example, investment in the oil sector fell in the last 10 years. And so now we have really high oil prices. We have a capacity shortage. I know everybody in Washington thinks it's all gouging, but actually there is a market. Actually, price is responsive to that global market. And so let's not forget that companies that keep investing, keep expanding capacity are more resilient against the kind of shocks we've had. Now, we couldn't, during the pandemic, find an N95 mask in America. We had to import them all from China. Now, this is not just an underinvestment story, it's an outsourcing story too, to James' earlier points. But, we've got to we have to think strategically about the manufacturing capacity that we have in this country, we keep in this country, that we need for resilience. But it's not all macroeconomic policy, it's also a function of high investment.
We've got,
Jimmy, you were going to quote the famous thing that relative to the topic that we're discussing. In the long run, we're all dead.
and
I hope that's not Jerry.
that's what we can maybe be a little bit more positive. Let me, to wrap up, let me give each of our speakers just 30 seconds for a concluding thought, starting with Jamie, if we could.
30 seconds.
30 seconds.
One more time. I think it's been a very useful discussion. And I hope we can continue it because we have a long way to go and a lot of trouble to face.
Well,
my parting message would be, when you succeed at something, you have to do more of it. Somehow that simple principle seems to elude policymakers in Washington. We are doing a good job on digital, let's just call it digital innovation. And wherever we've seen big investment in digital innovation, we've seen productivity gains, job gains, and job wage gains. So let's do more of it. Let's digitize the private sector, let's the physical economy. And by the way, we have reduced the number of people working in low and labor intensive, low productivity jobs in the healthcare sector. So redeployment of labor, so we don't allocate very efficiently. But the point is, we're doing some things right as a country, and maybe we should build on them rather than, follow Bernie and Elizabeth Warren, break up the big tech companies now is our best hope for staying ahead of the Chinese competition.
Well, I would say that relative to looking into the future, some people really get impatient with that sort of thing. Like, why should we look into the future? Because it's so uncertain. But I think it's really, really important because with some of these things that we're looking at, like record low fertility, record high debt, or record low economic growth, you're looking at 20 or 30 years. It's really important. It's not like saying that stuff is going to happen. Then those are not predictions, they're projections. And so what you're trying to do is figure out what are the public policies that we can adopt now that will prevent those things from ever happening. And so that's really the spirit of this thing, is to try to not to be gloom and doom, but to try to be uplifting about the sort of things that we could accomplish together to make for a better future.
it's been just a terrific conversation, especially in trying to look at things. But please join me in thank you. Thanks so much. Thanks to all of you for coming as well.